They say you never really know a person until you see how they treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for them. I learned that lesson the hard way, or maybe I should say, I taught that lesson the hard way. My name is Marcus Wellington, and this is the story of how I became invisible in my own empire, only to remind everyone exactly who owned the ground they walked on. It started on a Tuesday morning in September, the kind of morning where the New York air had just begun to hint at autumn, but the summer heat hadn't quite surrendered yet. I was pushing a cleaning cart down the marble floors of Wellington Tower, a 53-story monument to glass, steel, and ambition sitting right in the heart of Manhattan's financial district. The building bore my family's name, though nobody pushing past me that morning had any idea that the man in the gray janitor's uniform mopping their floors was the same Marcus Wellington whose signature sat on their employment contracts. Let me back up because I know what you're thinking. Why would a billionaire be mopping floors in his own building? The answer is both simple and complicated, like most things worth understanding. 6 months earlier, I'd been exactly where everyone expected me to be, the top floor corner office with the panoramic city views, the Herman Miller chair that cost more than most people's cars, the abstract art on the walls that I'd bought at auction without really looking at because my interior designer said it made a statement. I was 42 years old, running a commercial real estate empire my grandfather had started with 2 apartment buildings in Brooklyn, and my father had expanded into the fifth largest privately held real estate company in America. I had everything the world told me I should want, and I was absolutely miserable. Not because the work was hard or the money wasn't good. I was miserable because I'd spent 15 years in that office and I had no idea who actually kept my company running. I knew my executive team. I knew the major investors. I knew the board members and the department heads. But the people who actually made Wellington Properties function every single day. The maintenance workers who kept the buildings operating, the security guards who kept everyone safe, the administrative assistants who kept the chaos organized, the cleaning crews who made sure our prestigious image stayed pristine. I didn't know them at all. That realization hit me during a quarterly earnings call when one of our board members was complaining about rising operational costs. He specifically mentioned that we were spending too much on non-essential personnel and suggested we could cut costs by outsourcing our cleaning and maintenance to cheaper contractors. I nodded along because that's what I did in those meetings, nodded along while people who'd never cleaned a toilet in their lives talked about the people who cleaned toilets as line items on a spreadsheet. But something about it bothered me. So that night, instead of going home to my penthouse, I stayed late. It was around 8 p.m. I heard the cleaning crews come in. I watched from my office as a woman who couldn't have been more than 25 emptied my trash can. I'd seen her before, seen her in the way you see furniture as part of the scenery but not really registering as a person. That night I actually looked at her. She was careful, methodical, treating even the simple task of emptying trash like it mattered. When she finished with my office, she moved to the conference room, and I watched through the glass walls as she cleaned every inch of that massive table, straightened every chair to perfect alignment, and even wiped down the window sills that nobody ever looked at. I found myself wondering about her. What was her name? Did she have kids? What did she think about while she cleaned offices for people who never acknowledged her existence? And more uncomfortably, what did she think about me? That question kept me up that night, and the next night, and the night after that, so I did something crazy. I called my head of HR and told her I wanted to implement an undercover program where I would work entry-level positions in our company to better understand operational challenges. She thought it was a brilliant PR move. I let her think that, but it wasn't about PR. It was about the fact that I'd built an empire on the backs of people I'd never bothered to see as human beings, and that truth was eating at me. We kept it quiet, just me, HR, and my executive assistant knew. I took a 6-month leave of absence, which the company announced as a sabbatical for personal reasons, and I became Marcus Johnson, recently hired janitor for the overnight cleaning crew at Wellington Tower. The first night was humbling in ways I couldn't have predicted. The uniform felt wrong, not because there's anything wrong with being a janitor, but because I'd spent my entire adult life in custom suits, and the psychological shift of putting on that gray uniform was more jarring than I'd expected. The work itself was harder than I'd imagined. I'd thought cleaning was just mindless physical labor, but I was wrong. There's a skill to it, an efficiency and technique that the experienced workers had and I definitely didn't. My back ached, my knees hurt. My hands got raw from chemicals and scrubbing. But more than the physical challenge, it was the invisibility that shocked me. I'd gone from being someone whose presence commanded attention the moment I walked into a room to being someone people looked right through. Executives I'd had dinner with dozens of times walked past me without the slightest flicker of recognition. Not because I was in disguise, I wasn't wearing a fake mustache or anything, but because they simply didn't see janitors as people worth looking at. I learned more about my company in 2 weeks as a janitor than I'd learned in 2 years as CEO. I learned that the third floor women's bathroom had a leak that hadn't been fixed for 6 months because maintenance requests from that floor kept getting ignored. I learned that the security guard who worked the overnight shift, a 63-year-old man named Raymond, had been with the company for 27 years and had never once received so much as a birthday card from management. I learned that the cleaning crew had been asked to do more work with fewer people, and nobody upstairs cared that they were being pushed to their breaking point as long as the buildings looked clean. I learned that I'd been a terrible boss. But I also learned something else. I learned that most of the people working these jobs were incredible. They took pride in their work even when nobody noticed. They looked out for each other. They were funny and smart and had rich lives that had nothing to do with mopping floors. They were parents and students and artists and dreamers who happened to clean offices to pay their bills. And then there was my supervisor, a woman named Patricia who'd worked for Wellington Properties for 18 years. She was in her mid-50s, black like me, with gray streaks in her hair she wore pulled back in a tight bun, and she ran that cleaning crew with more competence and leadership than half my executive team. She was the one who trained me, who patiently showed me the right way to strip and wax floors, who taught me which chemicals to use on which surfaces, who corrected me when I messed up but always with respect. Patricia was also the one who told me after my first week that I was doing a good job. It was such a simple thing, but I realized no one had told me I was doing a good job in years. When you're the CEO, people tell you you're brilliant or visionary, but it's all tinged with ulterior motives. Patricia's compliment was real, and it meant more to me than any board commendation I'd ever received. I'd been working as a janitor for 3 months when everything changed. It was a Thursday night around 11 p.m. I was mopping the executive floor, which felt surreal, cleaning the hallways outside my own office, when I heard voices coming from the conference room. That was unusual. The executive floor was supposed to be empty by 9 p.m. I slowed my approach, and through the glass walls I could see 5 people sitting around the conference table. I recognized all of them. There was Richard Chamberlain, my chief financial officer, David Chen, VP of Acquisitions, Margaret Whitmore, General Counsel, and 2 others I didn't immediately recognize but who looked like outside consultants or lawyers. They were having a secret meeting in my building at 11 p.m. I should have walked away. I was undercover, and getting caught eavesdropping would blow everything. But something about the furtive nature of this gathering made my instincts scream that something was wrong. I positioned my cart nearby, making a show of mopping the floor right outside the conference room, and I listened. What I heard made my blood run cold. They were planning a coup, not a violent one but a corporate one. Richard was walking the others through a plan to declare me mentally unfit to run the company. They'd use my sabbatical as evidence of instability and install himself as CEO. He'd already lined up 3 board members who would support the move. They were planning to execute it in 2 weeks, right before I was scheduled to return, but it got worse. Margaret, my general counsel, who I'd trusted completely, was explaining how they could restructure the company to dilute my ownership stake. Since Wellington Properties was privately held, they needed my shares to take control, but she'd found a loophole involving a clause in the company charter that my grandfather had written 70 years ago that allowed for emergency restructuring if the leadership was deemed incapacitated. David was talking about which properties they'd sell off immediately to show improved earnings to potential buyers. He mentioned Wellington Tower specifically, said it was too expensive to maintain for what it generates, and they could flip it to a Chinese investment group he'd already been talking to. They were planning to steal my company, sell off its legacy, and profit from the betrayal. And they were doing it in my own building, probably feeling so secure that they didn't even bother to go somewhere private. I kept mopping, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to burst in there and confront them immediately, but I didn't, because I realized something important. If I confronted them now, they'd just deny everything, destroy whatever evidence existed, and probably accelerate their timeline. I needed to be smart about this. I finished mopping and pushed my cart away, but I'd heard enough. I also knew that the conference room had recording capabilities built into the table for when we recorded board meetings. If those microphones were on, everything they'd said would be captured. The next morning, I called my executive assistant from a burner phone and told her I needed her to retrieve any recordings from the executive conference room from the previous night. She was confused but did it. 2 hours later, I had a digital file of the entire conversation. I spent the weekend listening to it over and over, my anger building with each replay. These people I'd trusted, who I'd paid extremely well, who I'd promoted and relied on, were planning to destroy everything my family had built. And they were doing it not because I was a bad CEO, the company was performing well, but because they saw an opportunity to grab power and they took it. But as angry as I was, I realized this was also an opportunity. I could expose them, sure. But I could also use this to fix the larger problem I discovered over the past 3 months, because the rot didn't start with Richard and his conspirators. It started with a culture I'd allowed to flourish, where people at the top felt entitled to everything and people at the bottom were treated as disposable. I decided to let them continue, let them think their plan was working, and when the time came, I'd show them exactly what happens when you underestimate the person mopping your floors. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my life. I had to go to work every night and clean the offices of people who were actively plotting against me. I had to smile and nod when Richard walked past me in the hallway, not even glancing my direction, while I knew he was planning to steal my company. I had to watch Margaret, who'd been at my wedding, who I'd considered a friend, treat the cleaning crew like they were invisible while she worked late hours, probably strategizing my downfall. But I also kept learning. I started documenting everything. The maintenance issues that were being ignored, the cost-cutting measures that were hurting workers while executives got bonuses, the safety violations that were being covered up, the harassment that cleaning crew members faced from some of the executives, including one particularly ugly incident where David Chen made inappropriate comments to a 19-year-old woman on our crew, and when she reported it to HR, nothing happened. I gathered evidence of all of it because I realized this wasn't just about stopping a coup. This was about burning down a corrupt system and rebuilding it right. The confrontation I'd been planning finally came, but not the way I'd expected. It was a Monday night, 4 months into my time as a janitor. I was cleaning the executive bathroom when Richard Chamberlain walked in. He didn't acknowledge me, of course. I'd cleaned that bathroom while he was in it at least a dozen times, and he'd never once even nodded in my direction. but this time he was on the phone and he wasn't being careful about his volume. The board meeting is Friday, he was saying. We have the votes. Wellington won't even see it coming. By the time he figures out what happened, I'll be CEO and he'll be lucky if we let him keep his shares. He laughed at something the person on the other end said. No, I'm not worried about him fighting it. Marcus is too soft. That's always been his problem. He cares too much about legacy and not enough about profit. That's why he'll never understand why this is necessary. I kept scrubbing the sink, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. Trust me, Richard continued, by this time next week, Wellington Properties will finally have leadership that understands how to maximize value. First thing we do is dump that money pit of a tower and fire about 40% of the operational staff. The market will love it. He washed his hands. I moved aside without him even registering my presence and walked out. I stood there in that bathroom, gripping my scrub brush, and made a decision. Friday's board meeting was going to be very interesting. The next 3 days I prepared. I worked with my executive assistant, still the only person besides HR who knew who I really was, to set everything up. We scheduled an emergency board meeting for Friday morning, earlier than Richard's planned coup meeting. We sent the invitations from my executive assistant's email, making it look like routine business. Richard and his conspirators wouldn't think anything of it. I also did something else. I invited the entire operational staff, all the janitors, maintenance workers, security guards, administrative assistants, everyone Richard planned to fire, to a company-wide meeting immediately following the board meeting. Told them it was mandatory, that there would be major announcements about the company's future. Friday morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. in my penthouse apartment that I hadn't slept in for 4 months. I showered, shaved, and put on my best suit, a custom navy 3-piece from my tailor in London. I put on the watch my father had given me when I took over as CEO, the one that had been his father's before him. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself, not because I looked different, but because I felt different. The man looking back at me had spent 4 months mopping floors and emptying trash cans and being invisible, and that experience had changed me in ways I was still processing. I arrived at Wellington Tower at 7 a.m. The security guard at the front desk, Raymond, the 63-year-old who'd worked there for 27 years, looked up as I walked in and his eyes went wide. "Mr. Wellington," he said, standing up quickly. "Sir, we didn't know you were back." I smiled at him. "Good morning, Raymond. How's your granddaughter doing? I heard she got accepted to Howard." He blinked, clearly surprised I knew anything about his life. Yes, sir, she did. She's very excited." "That's wonderful. Howard's an excellent school. You must be very proud." "I am, sir, thank you." I headed to the elevator, leaving Raymond looking confused and slightly stunned. I'd learned about his granddaughter from Patricia, who'd mentioned it one night while we were cleaning. She'd said Raymond had been saving for years to help with tuition, but was worried it wouldn't be enough. I'd made a mental note, and now I was making a promise to myself that one of my first acts back as CEO would be implementing a scholarship program for employees' children. The executive floor was mostly empty when I arrived. My office had been maintained exactly as I'd left it. My assistant had made sure of that, despite pressure from Richard to let him move in. I stood at my desk, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, and took a deep breath. The board members started arriving at 8:30. I watched them on the security feed from my computer, saw their confusion when they walked past my office and saw me sitting there. Several of them immediately pulled out their phones. I could imagine the frantic texts flying to Richard. He arrived at 8:45 with David and Margaret in tow. I watched them get off the elevator, saw Richard's face go pale when someone told him I was in my office. He stood there for a moment, clearly trying to figure out what was happening, and then he straightened his tie and headed toward the conference room with a mask of professional composure settling over his features. At 9 a.m. exactly, I walked into the conference room. All 12 board members were there, along with Richard, David, and Margaret. The room went silent when I entered. "Good morning, everyone," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming on short notice." Richard recovered quickly. "Marcus, it's good to see you. We weren't expecting you back until next week." "I know," I said. "Plans changed." I opened my laptop and connected it to the conference room display. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I called this meeting. I want to share something with you. Over the past 4 months during my sabbatical, I've been conducting an experiment in organizational analysis." I clicked a button and the screen filled with photographs. Me in my janitor's uniform, me mopping floors, me emptying trash cans, me working alongside Patricia and the rest of the cleaning crew. The room erupted. Board members started talking over each other. Richard's face went from pale to bright red. Margaret looked like she might be sick. I waited for the noise to die down, then continued. "For 4 months, I worked as a janitor in this building. None of you knew. Why? Because I wanted to understand the company from the ground up. I wanted to see how we treat the people who actually keep this business running." I clicked to the next slide. It showed a maintenance request form from the third floor women's bathroom dated 6 months prior with a note that it had been submitted 7 times and never addressed. I learned that we ignore basic maintenance issues. I learned that we've been cutting operational budgets while increasing executive bonuses. I learned that we've created a culture where the people at the bottom are invisible to the people at the top. I advanced through more slides, documentation of the safety violations, the ignored harassment complaints, the cost-cutting measures that put workers in danger while executives enjoyed catered lunches and company cars. "But I also learned something else," I said, and now I looked directly at Richard. "I learned that while I was trying to better understand the people who work for this company, some of the people I trusted most were planning to betray me." I clicked to a new slide. The audio file from the late-night conference room meeting appeared on the screen. "This is a recording from a meeting that took place in this room 4 weeks ago at 11 p.m. I pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room. "The board meeting is Friday. We have the votes. Wellington won't even see it coming." I let it play for 30 seconds, then stopped it. "Should I continue? There's 45 minutes of this conversation where my CFO, VP of Acquisitions, and General Counsel discuss how they plan to have me declared mentally unfit, steal the company, and sell off its assets for personal profit." The room was dead silent. Richard had gone pale again. David was staring at the table. Margaret was crying. "Now," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest, "here's what's going to happen. Richard, David, Margaret, you're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You'll be hearing from our attorneys regarding criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and about a dozen other charges I'm sure we'll think of." I turned to the board. "For those of you who were planning to vote with Richard, I suggest you resign today. Because if you don't, I will remove you and make sure everyone in the business community knows why." 3 board members stood up immediately and left the room. "As for the rest of you," I continued, "we're going to have a very serious conversation about the culture of this company and how we're going to fix it. But first, I have another meeting to attend." I stood up and walked out, leaving them all sitting in stunned silence. The company-wide meeting was in the main lobby, which I'd had set up with a microphone and speakers. When I walked in, there were about 300 people gathered, all the operational staff from Wellington Tower, plus representatives from our other properties who we'd brought in for this. I saw Patricia standing near the front, her eyes wide when she recognized me. I saw Raymond, the security guard. I saw the young woman David had harassed. I saw all the people I'd worked alongside for 4 months, and now they were seeing me for who I really was. I took the microphone. "Good morning. For those who don't know me, my name is Marcus Wellington. I own this company." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "But for the past 4 months, you've known me as Marcus Johnson, janitor on the overnight cleaning crew." Now there were gasps. Patricia's hand went to her mouth. Several people started talking at once. I raised my hand for quiet. I didn't do this as some kind of prank or publicity stunt. I did it because I realized I had no idea who actually made this company work. I'd spent 15 years in an executive office making decisions about people's lives, and I didn't know anything about their actual lives. I paused, looking out at all these faces. What I learned humbled me. I learned that I'd built a company culture that treated some people as valuable and others as invisible. I learned that while I was congratulating myself on our success, the people doing the hardest work were being ignored, underpaid, and disrespected. I saw people nodding, some were crying. I learned that Patricia Rodriguez has more leadership ability than most of my executive team. I learned that Raymond Davis has dedicated 27 years to this company and never received proper recognition. I learned that every single person in this room has been taken for granted. That ends today, I said firmly. Effective immediately, we're implementing a 30% across the board raise for all operational staff. We're creating a profit sharing program so everyone benefits when the company succeeds. We're establishing a scholarship fund for employees' children. We're creating an open door policy where anyone, regardless of position, can bring concerns directly to executive leadership. The room was silent now, everyone hanging on my words. We're also creating a new leadership development program. Because I met people while mopping floors who are smarter, harder working, and more capable than some of the executives I've been paying six-figure salaries. If you want to advance in this company, you'll have the opportunity. I looked directly at Patricia. In fact, Patricia Rodriguez, I'd like to offer you the position of VP of Operations. You've been leading people for 18 years without the title or pay. Time to fix that. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. Several people around her started clapping, and soon the entire room was applauding. I know some of you are wondering if you can trust me, I continued when the applause died down. I don't blame you, I've given you no reason to, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I've learned from my mistakes, that I understand now that a company is only as good as how it treats the people who do the work. I set down the microphone and stepped off the small platform. People immediately surrounded me, some with questions, some just wanting to shake my hand. Patricia pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Wellington," she said, "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take the job," I replied, because I meant what I said. "You're the best leader I've seen in action." Yes, I'll take it." We talked for another hour, me answering questions, addressing concerns, listening to suggestions. This was what I should have been doing all along, actually talking to the people who made my company run. Finally, I made my way back upstairs. Security had already escorted Richard, David, and Margaret from the building. My assistant told me that two more board members had submitted resignations, and the remaining board had voted unanimously to support the changes I'd proposed. I sat in my office as the sun set over Manhattan, the same view I'd had before, but somehow different now. I'd spent 4 months being invisible, and it had taught me to finally see other people. I'd been humiliated by my own employees who didn't recognize me, and it had shown me how we'd created a culture where some people didn't matter. But the story doesn't end there. Over the next 6 months, Wellington Properties transformed. We didn't just implement the changes I'd promised, we exceeded them. Patricia turned out to be exactly as brilliant as I'd suspected, and under her leadership, our operational efficiency increased by 37% while employee satisfaction scores went through the roof. Raymond's granddaughter got a full scholarship through our new program, and Raymond himself was promoted to Director of Security. The young woman David had harassed became one of our most successful property managers after we put her through our leadership program. We also went public with my story, not because I wanted praise, but because I wanted other CEOs to understand what they were missing by staying in their corner offices and never talking to the people who actually did the work. The story went viral. I did interviews with major media outlets talking about what I'd learned and challenging other executives to try something similar. Some people called it a publicity stunt, but I didn't care. Because I knew the truth, it had fundamentally changed me and the company in ways that couldn't be faked. Richard, David, and Margaret faced criminal charges. Richard eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and served 18 months in federal prison. David and Margaret took plea deals. They all lost their licenses to practice in their respective fields. But the real victory wasn't in their punishment. It was in the transformation of Wellington Properties from a company that valued profit over people to one that understood they were the same thing. 3 years later, I was in my office when Patricia knocked on my door. She'd settled into her role as VP of Operations like she'd been born for it and had recently been promoted to Chief Operating Officer. "Got a minute?" she asked. "For you, always." She sat down across from my desk. "I wanted to talk to you about something. You know we're planning the expansion into the Philadelphia market. Right, 4 new properties. I think we should do something different. I think you should go work in one of those buildings undercover for a month, not as a janitor this time, maybe maintenance or security. See what we're missing?" I smiled. "You think I'm losing touch again?" "No," she said seriously. "I think you learned something valuable, and I think it's easy to forget those lessons when you're back in the corner office. I think we should make it a regular practice. You, me, other executives, we should rotate through entry-level positions in different properties, keep ourselves honest." She was right. The temptation to slip back into old patterns was always there. "Let's do it," I said, "but not just executives, everyone in leadership. If you want to manage people, you need to understand what their work actually entails." "Agreed." She stood to leave, then paused. "You know, when you first started on the cleaning crew, I thought you were going to quit after the first week. You were terrible at mopping." I laughed. "I was, wasn't I? But you kept showing up, you kept trying, and you listened when people tried to teach you. That's rare, especially in someone who's used to being the smartest person in the room." "I wasn't the smartest person in the room," I said. "That's what I learned. I was just the person with the most power, and I'd confused the two." After she left, I stood at my window looking out at the city. Wellington Tower still bore my family's name, but it meant something different now. It wasn't a monument to one family's wealth and success. It was a place where 300 people came to work every day and were treated with dignity and respect, where the person mopping the floors was just as valued as the person in the corner office. I thought about Richard and David and Margaret, who'd seen an opportunity to grab power and had taken it without caring who they hurt. They'd thought I was soft, that caring about legacy over profit was a weakness, but they'd been wrong. The company was more profitable than ever because it turned out that when you treated people well, they worked harder, stayed longer, and cared about quality. Revolutionary concept, right? I also thought about that first night as a janitor when I'd felt the shock of being invisible, how much it had hurt to be looked through rather than at. And I thought about all the people who felt that way every single day in my company and in companies all over the world. You never really know a person until you see how they treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for them. I'd failed that test for 15 years, but I'd learned. And more importantly, I'd changed not just myself, but an entire organization. Because that's the thing about power, it reveals who you really are. Richard and his conspirators had power, and it revealed their greed and willingness to betray. I'd had power and let it blind me to the humanity of the people around me. But power can also be used to lift people up, to create opportunity, to fix broken systems. That's what I was trying to do now. Not perfectly, I still made mistakes, still had to be called out when I slipped into old patterns, but I was trying. And every time I walked through Wellington Tower, I made sure to actually see the people working there, to know their names, to ask about their lives, to remember that the person mopping the floor or fixing the elevator or checking IDs at the security desk was a whole human being with dreams and struggles and talents. Because I'd been that person, I knew what it felt like to be invisible. And I'd made a promise to myself, standing in that bathroom listening to Richard plot my downfall, that if I survived this, I would never forget. So far, I'd kept that promise, and I intended to keep it for the rest of my life. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most humbling experiences. Sometimes you have to lose everything, or at least pretend to understand what actually matters. Sometimes the person mopping your floor is the person who owns the building, and you'd better hope you treated them with respect. Because in the end, we're all just people, and the measure of our character isn't how we treat those above us, but how we treat those we think are beneath us. That's what I learned mopping floors in my own building, and that's a lesson I'll never forget.